Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I hope that you all can understand my accent very well. I'll try and speak as slowly as I can. I'm from the eastern part of the United States, from Pennsylvania, but I lived in the Middle East for 15 years. So my accent now is a little bit in the middle. So it's a pleasure to be here with you today. And a special thanks to my old friend, Nikolai, Professor Nikolai, who I know from my institute in the United States. He was a visiting fellow with us at our institute, looking at concerning relations between Russia and Iran. I focus mostly on Syria. I lived in Syria for about 7 years. I knew Bashar al-Assad, the president, Asma al-Assad, his wife, and the entire regime inside of Syria. And a few years ago, I wrote a book about this experience. I think most of you know, by watching the news every day, that Syria is a disaster on a daily basis. 165,000 people have been killed. About, it depends on the numbers, about 700,000 have been injured, and about 200,000 are missing, either in prison, have been tortured to death, or are somewhere in neighboring countries. Right now, about half of Syria's population is outside of their homes. So Syria has about a population of 20 million, 22 million. So 10 million people are in neighboring countries or inside of the country outside of their homes. Right now, the crisis in Syria represents the largest humanitarian disaster since Rwanda, and politically is something very close to the former Yugoslavia, in that the country has broken into parts. There are three main parts today that the country has broken into. The western part, controlled by President Bashar al-Assad, and that is an area of the country that is dominated by minorities. President Assad's family comes from the Alawite sect, is an offshoot of Shia Islam, and around them are Christians, other Shia, as well as a number of Sunnis who cooperate with the regime. In the center of the country, we have the opposition, which is dominated by the majority Sunni population. And in the far eastern part of the country, we have the Kurdish areas, which are between the Sunni opposition and the regime. Currently, the fighting goes on a daily basis, and while the United States and Russia have tried to get the two sides to talk together in Geneva, what we call the Geneva II talks, President Assad inside of the country has increased the killing by the use of what are called barrel bombs. Barrel bombs are a few things. Sometimes they are gas canisters wrapped in metal that are detonated after they dropped out of helicopters. Sometimes they are sea mines, weapons that were supposed to be used in the sea from the Soviet era, weapons that were provided before 1990. And sometimes they are gas canisters, chlorine gas in particular, that are dropped on the opposition. This has increased the death toll over the last few months. So now approximately between 6,000 and 10,000 people die every month inside of Syria. So it's actually escalating. So while Russia and the United States have focused on talks, President Assad has increased the level of lethality inside of the conflict itself. As you know, and I don't have to explain this to you, there is a big problem between the United States and Russia at the moment over Ukraine, and specifically over the annexation of Crimea. But the effect of this goes beyond just Europe. It goes into the Middle East as well. Now, cooperation between Russia and the United States has gone down. It has continued on the disposal of chemical weapons in Syria. So far, about 93% of chemical weapons have left Syria, which is a good thing. But there are some problems. President Assad has decided to hold on to about 7% of his arsenal. And he is also refusing to destroy, he has 12 chemical weapons sites inside of the country. And both of these issues are, of course, violation of the agreement that was brought together between Russia and the United States. So far, we see no progress in resolving that matter. And I think it will continue for the foreseeable future. Concerning the political talks, I think cooperation between the United States and Russia is not working concerning the Syria crisis. Instead, now, the parties in Syria and around Syria are reaching out to the Iranians and to Saudi Arabia to try to get them to talk together. This is always a challenge. They hate each other. They are rivals in the region and actively work against each other. Also, Saudi Arabia and the Arab countries do not trust the Iranians at the moment because they are in negotiations with the United States over their nuclear program. And so the Arabs distrust both Iran and the United States, and therefore continue to pursue their own policies inside of Syria. Those policies until now have meant support for the opposition, but particularly for a part of the opposition which is not in the interests of the United States or Russia. And those are the extremists among the opposition itself. I think, as you know, there are a number of al-Qaeda affiliates inside of Syria. One is called Jabhat al-Nusra, the support front. But there is a faction that originally came from al-Qaeda that is so bad, al-Qaeda kicked it out of the organization. It's called the Islamic State of Iraq in the Levant, or ISIL. And they use very extreme tactics against anyone that they confront, including beheadings, crucifixions, and a variety of other desecrations, not only to the sensibilities of religion, but also to just, I think, all humans. And over time, they have grown in the north and the eastern part of the country. They're very intelligent. They take Syria's oil production, and they make their own refineries and sell the refined product, the gasoline and the diesel fuel, to the Assad regime. So it's a Machiavellian kind of enterprise. And the Assad regime, in exchange for that, does not attack ISIL. Even though they're the most fundamentalist, ISIL would regard those in the Assad regime as apostates, but there is a cooperation between them. Instead, the Assad regime bombs the moderate opposition, those that we were hoping would take over part of Syria in the future. And so far, it has not been very successful. I don't think that this is going to stop anytime soon. There is now, I think yesterday, some of you, or maybe all of you, saw that President Obama had a speech at West Point, at our military academy, in which he said that America would be more assertive in the world. I'm not really sure how truthful that is. Just as a little bit of a background to this, the reason why I'm in Russia is I was invited by your defense ministry to attend a conference in Moscow. It's the third Moscow Security Conference. And when I arrived, I didn't know what to expect. They did not tell us who was going to be speaking or what it was going to be about. I knew some officials were going to be there. But what we were told at the conference was the following: that the United States creates colored revolutions in parts of the world, and that includes the Ukraine, Syria, and many other places in the world, that this destabilizes the country, and then the United States backs the armed groups inside of that country, which get people to fight each other, and then overthrow that regime in order to take over the country. Now, I found this very interesting because actually, I think it gives President Obama a lot more credit than he deserves. For us in the United States, President Obama is perceived as a very weak president. In fact, his approval numbers right now are around 40%. And in our system, that's very low. It's extremely low. So, for example, President Bush, remember him? Yeah. His numbers were about this level when he left office. So we were very surprised.
Bush Jr.
Bush Jr., yeah. Bush Sr. was more popular. Bush Jr. So we were very surprised because President Obama was speaking yesterday because he is criticized for having no plan for foreign policy. Actually, most of his attention, he says, is focused on getting myself and all of us in the United States health care, which we do not have as part of our state system. I think, as many of you know, it's a big problem in the United States. And he's made some progress, but we have a lot of problems with the website to sign up. There are still a lot of problems. In any case, I don't think there is a plot by President Obama to take over the world using colored revolutions. It doesn't mean, though, that countries like Russia don't perceive the United States as a threat. Economically and in other respects, in terms of NATO and its obligations, what seems like defensive to the United States and a pacifist president like President Obama might seem aggressive from here in particular. So my message to you is, don't worry about this. I don't think there's any chance this is going to be coming to you anytime soon. But what President Obama did talk about yesterday was by being more assertive in the world, between being passive, which is what he's criticized to be, and being what we say aggressive, like George Bush Jr., okay? Invading Iraq, invading Afghanistan, and so on. So I think for the next few years, the United States will try and be more assertive in the world, and it will do so in the following ways. One, we are not going to withdraw from Afghanistan until 2016, at the end, it seems, with a very low number of troops, about 9,800. And that would mean more responsibilities for local players, the threat that more terrorist groups could come out of some of these populations, and most importantly, more problems probably for Russia. Ironically, it's probably better for your security if the United States stays in Afghanistan, but now that they're leaving, because it's more up to local players, there are more variables. There are other ways the United States is currently trying to be more assertive, and that also includes the working with the Syrian opposition. And this is where it gets very complicated. The moderates among the Syrian opposition have diminished in power over time, particularly after President Obama refused to strike the Assad regime for its use of sarin gas. Now, I realize some people believe this is a disputed fact. Some people say that the opposition used the sarin gas. I don't believe that, not just because of the gas itself, but how it was delivered. I also know President Assad very well and the system, and I do believe that they used it. And I think they have used it following that. And I think that's generally the intelligence assessments of the United States and its allies. But we can't tell going forward exactly what's going to happen. So as the extremist groups after that incident grew inside of the country, they felt abandoned, they felt like they were gassed, and no one came to their assistance. The extremists increased in power. So now we are in a situation of how do you deal with a part of a country with the following facts. President Assad does not have the military forces to retake all of Syrian territory. The only way he's been able to do what he's doing is through the involvement of Hezbollah from Lebanon and Iraqi Shia militias in particular. And they have helped him take about 60% of the country. On the other hand, the rebels do not have enough forces to take over the capital, right? And the Kurds, who are in the corner, don't have enough forces to take over anything but their general areas. The extremists among the opposition are attracted to fighting the regime and Hezbollah and those that they feel to be their enemies among the Shia forces that are around the regime. And in a way, it is sort of what we call it an evil symbiosis. The two forces fight each other. And this is where it's hard to explain, I think, when I speak in the United States, it's hard to explain. But here's the way that I can explain it. My family came to the United States in 1670. And the reason why is my family, we were Protestants, were in the southern part of Germany. And during the 30 Years' War and the Reformation, we were expelled to Holland, where the German government says we were evacuated to North America. It's not really evacuation if you have to pay for it, but anyways, this is a small thing, right? And so I think what's going on inside of Syria, the reason why I say this, is that it is like a sectarian war, like between the Protestants and the Catholics in Western Europe many centuries ago. And it generates extremism on both sides. What generates terrorism is violence and extreme injustice, and I think we can all agree on that. Now, after that, everyone has their choices, right? So the only way that we see to combat terrorism in the Middle East or elsewhere is by dealing with its source and by dealing with the symptoms. Now, until now, President Obama would rather deal with the symptoms than the source. He likes drones, these small aircraft. Now, we have so many of them in the United States, they almost run into commercial aircraft that are flying between cities. It happened the other day in Florida. He likes these because he can bomb people, and no Americans have to be threatened by the action. He also sees it as very clean. But the problem that's gathering in Syria, you can't drone strike your way out of it. Right? It's impossible. Because the extremism is growing, because the violence is growing, and also, and this is ironic, in order to fly your drones over Syria, we would need the permission of Bashar al-Assad, the president, which he's not going to give us, I don't think, because we say that he has to step aside as part of a political settlement in Syria. Now, this is where Russia and the United States disagree, okay? I think for the Russian government, they see the preservation of the current system with some modifications as the most rational way to stabilize Syria in the short term and in the long term. And on the surface, it seems reasonable, right? And we see similar actions in other countries. Egypt, where the military has come back to power. And also in other parts of the world where military governments have given some answers. The United States sees stability in a different way. We know that the Assad regime, because it's based on a minority and has killed so many people, is incapable of making the kind of changes, economic and political, that would stabilize the system in the long term. We also believe they do not have a number of troops to retake all of Syrian territory. So we think that when President Assad stays in the short and the long term, this actually causes instability and extremism. Whereas I think Russia sees it the opposite way. With an iron fist, there's a crackdown, and then there are some changes afterwards. And I think that's where I agree with American policy, in the sense that when I lived in Syria, I went there during a time in the year 2000 to 2008, after Hafez al-Assad, the former president, died, and Bashar al-Assad took power. And during those times, we did not really have a lot of pressure on him. We did not want him to go. He had it actually fairly easy There were some times when we were in Iraq that it was difficult, but during that time, there were no reforms. There were a few things. They opened some banks. They opened some insurance companies. But those kind of developments, which happen every day in the United States and every day in Russia as well. I mean, how common is it to open a bank or an insurance company? It's very common, right? In Syria, this was always reform. But the people in the country had undergone massive changes over the last 20 years that are against the Assad regime's numbers. The current situation, which I wrote about in my book, published a few years ago, comes out of one simple historical truth, and that is the previous uprising in Syria. I don't know if any of you have read about this, but between 1979 and 1982, there was an insurrection by the Muslim Brotherhood against the Assad regime, right? And if you notice, when you read about this time, you always notice that they always talk about how between 10 and 30,000 people died in February of 1982 when the regime surrounded their fourth largest city of Hama and used artillery to kill people inside. Right? 10 and 30,000 people. Why the difference? I mean, that's a very rough number, right? Well, journalism wasn't very good then. There was not YouTube videos and these other things, that's true. But it's mostly because around that time, the Assad regime launched a massive crackdown in the country, and they arrested all opponents, not just Muslim Brotherhood, also communists, Arab nationalists, and anyone else who opposed the Ba'athist regime inside of Syria. And they locked them up for about 10 years. Many of my friends inside of Syria, their families, many members of their families died at that time, and they never know what happened to them. I still have a friend of mine in Syria who every year the regime, the security services, and there are 7 security services in Syria, come to their house looking for their father. And my friend answers the door and says, well, we were hoping you could tell us where he is, because he's been missing since February of 1982. The regime also requires them to file tax returns every year for a man who has been dead, as they know from rumors inside of the country, who died under torture in 1984. So during that time, those 10 years after the Hama massacre, between 1982 and 1992, everyone stayed home. The foreign currency in the country dried up. They couldn't import anything. There was no toilet paper. There were very basics. People couldn't travel without permission. Now, what happens when men and women have to stay indoors for very long periods of time together? Anyone?
Children.
Children, right, exactly. There are some other things that happen in there, but yes, generally children, right? For 10 years, Syria was among the 20 fastest growing countries on the planet. So like sub-Saharan African levels of reproduction, okay? In the heart of the Middle East. And that's the reason why all the people you see in the videos fighting against the Assad regime, what is their hair color and their beard color? Is it gray? It's black, jet black, right? Young people, a lot of young people, especially in rural areas. There are just way too many Sunnis. And the Alawites in the regime and the other minorities had very few children. Okay. And that's the reason why the uprising has gone on for as long as it has. Now that doesn't mean that the opposition can't make a lot of mistakes. And I have to say, I love the Syrian people, but the Syrian opposition is very difficult to support in many ways. It's not because they're not nice people. Many of them are. But they politically have a very difficult time organizing. I think there are a lot of reasons for it. One is, when you've been suppressed for that long of a time, and suppression, you feel the ability to express yourself, you very quickly go from being depressed to grandiose. Suddenly it's all about you, not about your party or about your nation. And I think that's been a fair criticism of the opposition. The other problem has been that others in the region, particularly Salafists, and jihadists from elsewhere in the region have taken advantage of the situation in Syria and used it to build up their forces. The other is, it's very difficult to think when you're being gassed, bombed, and shelled on a daily basis. It doesn't lead to rational thought. And unfortunately, until now, the elites inside of the Syrian opposition have not come together. But there are some small incremental changes among the opposition that have taken place in the last year, where we have more groupings inside of the country, and now the Syrian opposition, in what's known as the Syrian National Council, has begun visiting Western capitals, including Washington, in order to get support. Maybe they will be coming to Moscow. I don't know. I doubt it. But you never know. Wait and see. In the end, the Syrian conflict is going to go on for a very long time. I was just in Jordan before I came here, and I met with many officials when I was there. And the simple truth of the matter is this: if the Assad regime holds on, it does not have enough forces to stabilize the country. If the opposition wins, we'll have extremism and also a lot of chaos. And if the current situation continues, we will have more and more instability and extremism that comes out of Syria and goes to neighboring countries. Now, myself and my girlfriend Madeline, we live in Washington, D.C. That's thousands of miles away from Syria, and there's a big ocean in between. Russia lives a little closer to Syria, about 1,000 kilometers in terms of territory, but here in St. Petersburg, I'm not exactly sure. How many more kilometers? 2,000, okay. So, but you're a little closer. And the longer this goes on, the more extremism we're going to have. And the more extremism we have, the more unsafe the world is going to be. So I hope in the future we're going to have some kind of cooperation between the United States and Russia towards a real settlement in Syria. I don't think that's going to happen this year for various reasons. But I hope you and your individual studies can help stabilize Syria in the future, even though I think all of the situation is not my fault or your fault. And hopefully we can make it a better situation for Syrians and for everyone going forward. And on that happy note, I'm going to end, and I'd be happy to take any questions that you have, or clarifications if you didn't understand my accent. So thank you.
Thank you. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the floor is open for questions, comments, whatever. Yes, please. Could you kindly introduce yourself?
My name is David. I am a student of Faculty of International Relations. Thank you for the speech, and my question is, what do you think about the role of Turkey in the Syrian crisis?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Well, okay, so Turkey is, as you know, nominally a secular country, but is ruled by the AKP, the Prime Minister Erdogan's party. Prime Minister Erdogan's party is ideologically close to the Muslim Brotherhood. It's not the same, but it's ideologically close. So previous to the Syrian uprising, Prime Minister Erdogan had very close relationship, he thought, with President Assad. He thought that he was a very good neighbor, and it helped Turkey develop its trade to its south and gave it strategic depth. But over time, Prime Minister Erdogan became angry because every time he spoke with Bashar al-Assad on the phone to say, stop killing your own people, he didn't listen. And finally, after a while, Prime Minister Erdogan decided that President Assad had to go. So, how do you get President Assad to go when President Obama doesn't want to do more militarily to end the regime? Right? So what you do is you support the opposition and you allow them to go into areas. And first it was the peaceful protesters, but over time it was also armed fighters. But there's a sad truth to one aspect of the Syria crisis, and that is some of the extremist fighters and the Salafists in general have been the most effective. They're focused, they have more identity, and also they have a lot of help from the Arab Gulf in terms of funding, and also foreign fighters which have come to Syria to fight. So Turkey and its military intelligence allowed these fighters to come into opposition areas. Now, it did not do so publicly. The evidence I have for that is zero, but I also know, because I've lived in Turkey for a long time and I did a lot of work there, there's no way all of that happens without Turkish military intelligence knowing about it, okay? In the Middle East, the mukhabarat, or the intelligence services, are very good, okay? And it's hard to explain, but they use networks of informers. In fact, mukhabarat as an Arabic word means informers. It doesn't mean intelligence services. Anyways, they use it to effectively control the border. So Turkey allowed the buildup of Salafists in particular, and also of extremists inside of opposition areas. I think it did so for two reasons. One is they were more effective at fighting the regime. Two, they also fought against the Kurds inside of Syria and kept them in check. So it was a double benefit for Turkey in the short term. In the long term, it's a liability, though, because these extremist forces do not support the government in Ankara. And I think it will cause a lot of destabilization in the future. So Turkey has played a problematic role in this. Let's hope they change their minds.
Thank you for your speech. My name is Konstantin. I'm assistant professor in here, and I wanted to ask you a question about Iman Foundation. You know, this foundation probably headed by the cousin of Dr. Assad, Mr. Bala al-Assad. And I was wondering, what does this foundation stand for? I mean, just from origin, or what do they do in main activities, and what kind of, if any, influence do they have in the situation and to do something?
Yeah, it's a very good question that I do not have a good answer for. Okay, Ribal al-Assad is the son of Rifat al-Assad, who was the brother of Hafez al-Assad, the former dictator. Remember that time when I said they didn't have any hard currency in Syria? Well, it mysteriously happened the same time that he had to leave the country. So, how did all of the members of Rifat al-Assad's family get so much money? We suspect it's because Hafez al-Assad's mother arranged for Rifat to leave the country and take a lot of the hard currency reserves from the treasury. Now, I'm not sure if this is true. Nobody could ever tell if it was true. In any case, after that, Ribal and his other brothers have set up this foundation, and they want to talk about the future inside of Syria. And to this day, I'm not sure what future they have in mind. And there's a very good reason for that. Ribal and his brother Siwar have not been allowed to come to the United States, at least as far as I know. And if they have, it's been either very quietly. I know there were a number of times when they were coming, but until I have a good conversation with them, I'm not sure exactly what their game plan is. I think they're planning, like many others, that this conflict's going to go on for a long time, and they are, as we say, throwing their hat in the ring to become a player in the current situation. But I don't know to what end. Sorry, I can't answer it more effectively.
Other questions?
Thank you for interesting presentation. I'm Vladimir Sharov from the same department. It's impossible to stay here, but I have several questions. First, some of them are psychological. What do you think about the motivation of Shahids who fight from the side between factions of Al-Qaeda or former Al-Qaeda, the Fatah al-Nusra and the ISIS, for example? Or what should they blow themselves when they fight their brothers in the religion?
Right.
That's the first question.
Okay, so you're talking here about the battles we've seen between Jabhat al-Nusra and ISIL, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. It's an interesting phenomena. I think ideologically, given that both are Sunni-based organizations, Sunni Salafist organizations, that ideologically it's easier for them to carry out suicide bombings against the regime because it's controlled by Shia and other minorities, And also the regime has killed a lot of people, so it makes sense in a ideological and partially in a nationalist sentiment. But when they start attacking each other, it becomes very interesting, because the difference between the two groups in terms of ideology would not seem that different. In terms of the scope of their plans, it seems quite different. For example, Jabhat al-Nusra primarily has aspirations for inside of Syria. Doesn't mean that it doesn't want to liberate Palestine, it doesn't mean all these other things, but primarily its orientation is inside of Syria. For ISIL, they want the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. And the Levant is a very big thing, so that would be like Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, and parts of Iraq. And what we've seen is the most dedicated of the fighters have decided that carrying out terrorist activities, particularly ISIL against Jabhat al-Nusra, is permissible. How and ideologically it's carried out is based on the different decisions of the leaders for each organization, particularly ISIL. And I think it's led to this schism and for Al-Qaeda to throw out ISIL. I think it's a permanent split. I think in the future they will only have a ceasefire between them. We will have to watch, though, if in the future they are able to take fighters from ISIL and Jabhat al-Nusra and bring them over to more moderate organizations, such as the Islamic Front or over to other factions. How you do so with ideologically driven people, I'm not sure.
If possible, some more questions. You said that you had a contacts with Assad's family. It would be very interesting if it's possible to tell about that in details, and what did you feel about the psychology and the roles of different persons? Because it seems like President himself was not an aggressive person, vigilant,
right.
Calm, mild, and so on.
Sure. Yeah, it's a very good question. Okay, here's my opinion. We all have people in our lives who are two things at the same time. All of us have people like this in our lives. There are different words for it, right? Some people say two-faced, Janus-faced, right? Borderline personality, right? Some people are smiling back here, right? I think Bashar is this, okay? And I think the reason why I believe that isn't because I was drinking vodka with Bashar, or beer or anything else, but because of the track record of engaging him, okay, of particularly European and American diplomats. So for example, let's forget about the current uprising if we can. Let's go back to 2010. In 2010, US and Israeli intelligence saw the Assad regime providing Hezbollah with Scud missiles inside of Lebanon, moving them across the border. This caused a big problem with our policy, because at that time we were engaging Bashar. He was the answer, right? We were talking to him about a peace treaty between Israel and Syria that would change everything. So everyone said, well, why would he do this? Strategically, it's very difficult, right? Because once you give a strategic weapon, like Scud missile, and we call them Scuds. I don't know, what do you call them in the Russian lexicon?
I can understand what you're talking about.
It's a NATO designation, sorry. A Scud, okay. It's essentially a developed V2 rocket, right? I mean, so we call it a strategic weapon. So once you give a strategic weapon like a Scud or gas or something like this to a third party, you take yourself out of the equation, right? Because you allow someone else to take advantage of this. Hezbollah suddenly can shoot this Scud missile at Israel and destabilize the entire situation. So we went to Bashar and we said, and it was actually John Kerry, our Secretary of State, and they laid down the satellite photography in front of him. And they said, what's that? And he said, oh, it's nothing. They said, no, what is this? This is a Scud rocket going across the Lebanese frontier to Hezbollah. He said, no, you got it from the Israelis. He said, no, this is an American film. Right? John Kerry left there. He had no idea why Bashar will tell you whatever you want to hear. Right? This is a similar pattern to what he told Syrians in terms of reforming the country. So, for example, he would constantly say, we're going to have reforms. He would pass legislation through the parliament to reform the country. But very few of those laws ever made it to actual reforms. Very few executive instructions would come from the ministries. And even when the executive instructions came, they would contradict large parts of the Syrian constitution. Right? So what would happen is, in order to change, in order to do new things, people had to pay bribes, right? And the corruption inside of the country expanded. No one could tell why Bashar did this. He would promise reforms and yet never deliver them. And to this day, I'm not sure why. I think it has something to do with the regime is inelastic, meaning the core members are unable to expand or to compete effectively. So, for example, we were having a conversation last night about after the Soviet Union came apart, there was a contestation between different elites inside of the country concerning economic activities, for example, right? Former communists, former members of the intelligence services, and others. And they competed with one another, sometimes very aggressively. Inside of Syria, they do not permit this kind of competition. It is rigid. And I think it will remain rigid given the current circumstances. And so therefore, I don't think the Assad regime is capable of reform because of the psychological construct of Bashar and the regime that he represents. And I don't think this is fundamentally changed.
Excuse me, is he the real decision maker? Maybe he's just like a whale and Bashar al-Assad or Maher do take many decisions.
I think they take some decisions together. I think he's the final decision maker. But I think they take some decisions together. So that could explain some of the two-faced nature, right? So for example, if Nikolai and I are in business and I go and negotiate with you, and I promise you that I'm going to sign this contract and we're going to make a lot of money, and then I go to Nikolai and Nikolai says, well, you know what, that's probably not a very good idea. Right? Now, then I come back to you and say, well, remember that contract we signed? Well, let's forget about it, okay? Now, you can get away with this once, but when you do it over a very long period of time, and with Bashar, it was specifically 11 years, it catches up with you. And I think, in the end, he represents an entity, again, that's not elastic. Now, important thing to watch, though. I think that the Assad regime is extremely corrupt, and that means that maybe part of the solution to this, before it's all over, could be based on one fact. No one ever leaves the Assad regime unless it's in a coffin. Okay? So far we've had about 6 members of the Assad regime who have been either killed in bombings or assassinated or suicided. Okay? Suicided is when you commit suicide with 7 bullets. Okay? And that's happened multiple times in Syria. That's the only way you ever leave the regime. The only members who have been allowed to go have been those that are of Sunni origin, a couple from the time of the father. One of them is Abdul Halim Khaddam. He's in Paris, but he left in 2005, long before this. So it could be one of the solutions going forward is, one day we might wake up and Bashar al-Assad's dead. And then maybe Maher will be the president. Or maybe Maher will be dead. And Bashar and his sister, who's in Abu Dhabi, might be president. But we just don't know. It's a black hole. And I expect that it will remain a black hole for a while. Thank you for the question.
I know during the... Oh, sorry. My name is Michael Camarda. I'm a student of Professor Krzanos. And my question is, I know, correct me if I'm wrong, but during the Assad regime, both he and his father, it's not always so easily sectarianly divided that you have these business elites who are Sunnis that also work with the regime. Can you tell me at least what percentage of the Sunnis still either support the regime or don't support the uprising because they know that we've got a broken state is to come, perhaps,
Sure.
and it's bad for business, it's bad for the future?
Yeah.
What were the sort of percentages in supporting, if you could just kind of...
Yeah, well,
I know you can't do polls in
yeah,
this kind of...
you can't do polls in Syria, and elections, we're about ready to have an election in Syria. Bashar al-Assad is running for re-election, his third re-election. So I observed the last ones, and I wrote about it in my book. It was really something to see. As you know, I'm an American, as you can probably tell, I'm an American citizen. That's my only nationality. And I went into the polling station to talk, to see what was going on inside of there. And I found some Lebanese with their identity cards. They did not have Syrian identity, and they were voting. And the woman who was running the polling station asked me to vote. And I said, well, you know I'm not, I said to her in Arabic, you know I'm not Syrian. She said, oh, it doesn't matter. Right? And to this woman, it's completely reasonable, right? The campaign posters for Bashar have a picture of Bashar looking very handsome and tough. And behind him is a thumbprint, right? In the colors of the Syrian flag. Do you know why there's a thumbprint? Because in Syria, they encourage you to vote with your blood. And so she pulled out a pin, and she pricked her finger and voted. And I have the photo on my phone. So the reason why I told you this story is because we don't know how many people actually support Bashar. For the moment, particularly among the business community, if you're around Damascus, you're probably going to vote for Bashar because you don't want to lose your business. Also, you don't know what's coming from the opposition, so you don't know when you can flip. But the truth is, when you speak with people in Syria, whether they're Sunnis or even minorities, most of the time they don't like Bashar himself. They just are sticking with him for the moment. There are many times when people support a tyrant. And what I mean by tyrant isn't George Bush ideology here, okay? And I'm not talking about tyranny and all these other things, right? Tyranny is just arbitrary power, okay? It means you can do whatever the hell you want and nobody can do anything about it. And that's the way Bashar is, right? And that's the way his regime operates. And unfortunately, doing whatever you want in Syria has also meant murdering a lot of people and a lot of death and destruction and so on. So I suspect that Bashar al-Assad is going to win the election on June 3rd. He's running against two members who have been allowed to run against him this time. This is the first contested election for president. But if anybody was betting anything, I would bet 100 rubles on Bashar al-Assad to win. And we can all argue about the percentages, but I would say definitely above 70%.
Any other questions? Yes, please.
My name is Max. I'm also a student of jihadists, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the involvement of international jihadists in the conflict, particularly those coming from, I guess, the Northern Caucasus region and Central Asia. How do they help to stabilize any sort of possibility for peace or power sharing, and what will happen once they leave?
Yeah. Okay, so there are various estimates on foreign fighters inside of Syria. Some people say 20,000, some people say 10, but the countries they come from vary. Libya, Europe, surprisingly. Also, some of the most hardcore fighters come from Chechnya and other parts of the Russian Federation. They are products of the ongoing war here between the state and those organizations. And they have gone to Syria to fight. And over time, it's one of these problems. And this, again, the reason why I didn't agree with the your defense ministry's version of events concerning the American plot to, and here's why. I think that the reason why they're there is they are attracted to this violence, this sectarian violence, and they hear about it. And there's one thing that makes it easy for them, and that is location. Okay, Afghanistan, you can say what you want about it, where they call it the graveyard of empires, right? We've lost a lot of people in Afghanistan. You lost a lot of people in Afghanistan. But Afghanistan, it's hard to get there unless you border it, right? It's just hard. It's far away. There aren't very many flights. Turkey is easy to get to. Turkish Air is a great airline, by the way. Okay, I wouldn't use it to fly there for jihadist activities, but it's easy to get there. It's very cheap, right? It's inexpensive, and it flies from all over the world. They have more flights. Turkish Air has more flights than any other airline in the world, and it's very easy to get into Turkey. You just buy a visa on the frontier from many countries. So what's happened is over time, it's become easy to get there, and they're attracted by the violence, and more foreign fighters have become involved. Now, this is where the hard part comes in. Once you let it go this long and all the foreign fighters show up, then you have to decide what are you going to do with them. And this is where Europeans in particular are freaking out about the future. They're actually worried that the war is going to end tomorrow, because when the war ends, if it did, and it's not, so they would go home to their countries. For example, Britain or Belgium or various places. And they are battle trained, right? And they will carry out extremist activities there. They are also a very unpredictable force, right? And that has led a lot of people to say, again, we should change, support the Assad regime, and let them kill them. Well, the hard part is, again, they don't have enough troops, and they're running out of Scud missiles. So, in comparative terms, this is the third largest use of Scud missiles on civilian populations ever. So first was Adolf Hitler during the Second World War, particularly on Britain, but also in the Soviet Union. Second was the Najibullah regime in Afghanistan after the Soviet Union pulled out. And now a distant third is Bashar al-Assad. So we don't know how he's able to completely deal with this. So instead of that, the Western countries have implemented two policies. One is to support the moderate opposition inside of Syria, to try and isolate the extremists. Two is to use surveillance activities on departures from Syria and in Turkey, cooperate with Turkey in order to detect when these people leave and go back to their home countries. But I doubt they're going to be able to catch everyone. And it's become a worrying part of this entire war, and one that I don't think is going to go away anytime soon.
I have more questions, but please.
Hello, my name is Sergey. I'm a student of the Oriental Department, and I would like to ask you a question. You've mentioned about the Kurdish regions in Syria, and I'd like to ask you if any kind of cooperation exists now between the forces of the Kurdish regions and the forces of the Syrian opposition. Do they struggle together or maybe separately?
Yeah, it depends. Okay, so in the Kurdish regions, please, it's okay. In the Kurdish regions, we have a mix of forces. One is called the PYG, and the PYG is it is an offshoot of the Kurdistan Workers' Party. Okay, so this is Abdullah Öcalan's organization, and they have fought against many of the members of the Sunni-led opposition, and particularly against the extremists among the Sunni opposition. They have declared in that area some autonomy. They call it Rojava. Rojava means Western in Kurdish. I'm not a Kurdish speaker, but I know this word. And the PYG competes with an organization called the KNC, the Kurdistan National Council, who are more moderate and work more closely with the Sunni opposition. But as the Sunni opposition has become more extreme in that area, Kurds have been forced to work together. And it's created a new dynamic that has caused more Kurds to carry out more autonomous activities. There is some concern that they might join with the Kurdistan in northern Iraq. And I think you can expect to see that going forward. Also in that area, it's interesting, you still have regime elements in that area. So they cooperate also with the regime at certain crossings and in certain areas. They play a middle middle road between the regime and the Sunni-led opposition. I think because they don't trust either of them. And so they'll wait to see who wins and be very pragmatic and cooperate with whoever takes over those areas.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Anybody else?
I can, but if it's possible. And my
Just one.
question, then one, more general one. What do you think in general about the possibility of arranging democratic rule in the Arab country? And in this context, let me comment also. You know for sure that Alawites are more close to Turks and to Westerns, I would say, from the point of view of civilization. Yeah? They allow more freedoms in their everyday life. Their women are more free than Sunni women. And from this point of view, could you imagine any time that Alawites and moderate opposition could be allies against extremists close to Jabhat al-Nusra or
Sure.
ISIS?
Yes and no. It depends on the areas. In urban areas, I think many Sunnis and businessmen in particular cooperate with the regime because they don't like ISIL, they don't like Jabhat al-Nusra. The harder part comes in the rural areas. And there you need the moderate opposition to work with the regime against the extremists. But until now, the Assad regime continues to bomb the moderates and not the extremists. Again, it's this Machiavellian, until now. In the future, it's possible, but I think it's, for example, Lakhdar Brahimi, who was the UN representative to Syria, just resigned. And the reason why he resigned was that President Assad decided that a negotiated, what we call transitional governing body, the TGB, we call it, which is in the Geneva Communique of 2012, negotiated between the United States and Russia in Geneva, that talked about a negotiated settlement, what you're referring to. And Lakhdar Brahimi resigned because President Assad's idea of a transition was for him to run for re-election in the country, not to put together an actual transition body. In the future, I think he will get some to cooperate with him. But I think by running for re-election, it puts some inelasticity on the regime, meaning the regime doesn't have to change very much. And if it doesn't change, it will not accommodate all the people. So I think what we'll have, and this is my forecast, I don't know if it'll happen, is that we will end up with a divided Syria in the long run. Maybe the regime will be controlling the West, but it seems hard politically or militarily for the regime to retake all of those areas. And I think that causes a problem for the United States, Russia, and everyone's allies in the region because of the extremists who fill up those areas. The other part too is that until now, Israel has allowed the Iranians to put their troops and their supporters in Syria. So Hezbollah now operates in Syria. We also have Quds Force operating in Syria, and the Abu Fadl al-Abbas brigades, which are Iraqi Shia. Until now, Israel has been okay with this. They bomb Syria quite frequently to destroy weapons that are transferred there. But the other stuff they just let go. I don't know how long they're going to be comfortable with this, because there's something. Okay, if I have any advice to you, if you ever want to work on anything like I do or like these gentlemen do, I have one bit of advice from a friend of mine. It's if you want to write in the future, write about where the ball is going to be kicked, not who is kicking the ball right now, right? And where the ball is being kicked in the future, I think will concern two basic facts. One is the United States and Iran are about ready to sign an agreement over its nuclear program. Now, I don't know whether it will be in July, which is the deadline is July 19th, or if it will be extended, okay? But President Obama really wants a deal, okay? Because the rest of his foreign policy doesn't work, okay? Sometimes you just really want it. Okay? And he really wants a deal. Now the problem is that deal has to satisfy your regional allies. At least in the past it did. And our regional allies are like Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries and Israel. I don't think they're going to be satisfied with this deal, okay? Because of it's going to mean that Iran is going to be a nuclear threshold power, meaning they're not going to have a bomb, but they're going to be able to continue research and development, and they will be relatively close. Now, I think that's going to happen. Maybe it's going to be in July, maybe it's going to be in December. Maybe Nikolai disagrees with me, I don't know. But this is going to upset a lot of people, particularly the Arabs and the Israelis. And there's another realization, and that is Bashar al-Assad isn't going anywhere. And those Iranian forces are gathering around him, and that's the way he's been able to come back. That's quite a shift. I lived in the region for a long time. I've been dealing with it for over 25 years. To have that many Iranian forces all over the Levant, that powerful, spilling that much blood, is unprecedented. And I don't think that the Arab Gulf countries are going to take it lying down. Now, the problem with Arab Gulf countries in general, and I'm generalizing here, okay, is that the way Arab Gulf countries fight, they don't tax their own people or take their oil money and raise a big army and go and invade a neighboring country. Right? What they do is they fight it asymmetrically, meaning they back factions to fight other factions. And so I think that's what they're going to do in Syria. They're going to continue to back these factions. And until now, those factions have been Salafist or extremist in nature and are growing. Now, there have been a lot of negotiations between the United States and Saudi Arabia to support the more moderates. But yesterday, President Obama said he was going to support moderates, but most people that I knew read the speech, including myself, and did not see a lot of detail in there. I think it's what they call in Arabic kalam fadi, means, what's the translation? Loose words. I think that what we're probably likely to see is more backing of those groups going forward and more fighting. That's it.
Thank you for your speech. My name is Hek. I'm an economist, and the question, what interest has Iran in Syria?
Oh, all right. Well, this is it's a very good question. Actually, it's a focus of some of my research. So, Iran has some basic interests. One is Iran supports Hezbollah in Lebanon. Okay? And Hezbollah in Lebanon has a long history, and it's tied up with the United States. Okay? So, for example, many people will tell you that the reason why there's a problem between the Islamic Republic of Iran and the United States is because of Israel. Well, it's true, Israel's an ally, but that's not the real reason. Okay? It's because of what happened in 1979 with the takeover of our embassy. I think you remember this. But also what happened in Lebanon during the 1980s, in the early 1980s. Okay? So Hezbollah was given birth there by the Pastaran, the Iranian External Intelligence Agency. And there were a lot of kidnappings of Americans, and also bombings of our embassy, as well as a Marine barracks in Lebanon. So now the reason why I bring this up is, in comparative terms, okay, the bombing of the Beirut barracks, okay, that was the largest single-day death toll for the Marine Corps, the American Marine Corps, since the Battle of Iwo Jima. And I don't expect you to be military historians. This happened long before we were all alive, most of us anyway. But that was the most horrific battle in the Pacific during the Second World War for the United States. Okay. So Hezbollah is in Lebanon primarily, though, to confront Israel. And they see Israel and the United States as a regional project. Their interest is in supporting Hezbollah in Lebanon. And earlier last year, in 2013, they knew that the Assad regime was going to fall. They knew it was making disastrous mistakes, so they began to intervene inside of Syria to secure the western part of the country. And I think that's primarily where Iran's interests are. They say they're backing the Alawite regime there, and the Alawites are Shia, right? So mainline Shia from Iran are what we call 12ers. They're waiting for the 12th Imam. Alawites are 11ers. They're waiting for the 11th Imam. Now, there's a tremendous difference, though, between one Imam to another. Alawites are very secular. Mainline 12er Shia often are not, often. In any case, politically, they share this overlap. And that was developed over time, from the old regime under Hafez al-Assad until today. Now, I think they primarily use it as a way to continue their pressure on Israel and US allies as a whole, as part of what they call a second strike capability. Israel has threatened many times that it will not accept an Iranian nuclear weapon. I'm pretty sure they want a nuclear weapon. That's my opinion. I think that they would like to have one. Whether they'll get one or not, I don't know. But they want to have an insurance policy for if they get a weapon. And their insurance policy is Hezbollah. So Hezbollah in southern Lebanon has a number, tens of thousands of rockets and missiles pointed at Israel. So if Israel bombs Iran, Hezbollah then strikes Israel. So the theory goes. I think that's where primarily their interests remain. Economically, though, for Syria, for Iran, the regime is a net drain. They have to put a lot of resources there. And I think, it's my opinion, I think that strategically, one of the outcomes of the American policy in Syria, the hands-off policy, has been to drain Iran of resources at a time when it's negotiating over its nuclear program. I would suspect this is it. Right?
Well, they're aiming at spending up to $6 billion to support Syria as a minimum
So $6 billion is a lot, and that's just the stuff we can count, right? There is trade in diesel fuel. So for example, Iran is addicted to gasoline. Syria is addicted to diesel fuel, or mazot. So Iran produces a lot of mazot. And so it exports a lot of that mazot, that diesel fuel, to Syria. And that's what keeps everything going inside of Syria. So that's one area of cooperation. I think what's going on at the moment, if I was to guess, that you'll notice in the speech yesterday, President Obama didn't talk about Iranian involvement in Syria. He just talked about extremism. I think what he's trying to do is he's trying to entice or to encourage Iran to become more involved in Syria. So it pins them down and causes them to spend more money, I think. And at the same time, he's going to give some more assistance to the moderate opposition to push against Assad and to fight extremists. And then he waits. Watch what happens after July 20th, July 19th, concerning negotiations in Iran. If we have an agreement, watch what happens in Syria. If we don't have an agreement, watch what happens in Syria. If we have a delay, watch what happens in Syria. And we'll have to wait and see what happens.
Okay, I believe just very short questions, hopefully.
I can take very quickly ones. Please.
My name is Ksenia. I'm a student of St. Petersburg State University, and my question, what do you think, what will be happened exactly for understanding Russia and the United States with Syria question? And can it be disclosed as well?
Yeah, I don't think look. See, you always had to ask the last question, see? Okay, so here's my guess. I think what's going on right now is kind of personal. I think it's between your president and my president. All right? I guess. It seems a bit, right? I mean, it seems a bit personal. And this represents an unpredictable nature to this, right? I don't think a lot of you, for example, recently when there was the decision to take over the Crimea, you were probably waiting to find out, and I think a lot of people in your government were waiting to find out as well. Right? They didn't know. Right? President Obama also makes very strange decisions, especially on Syria. For example, after the use of chemical weapons in Syria, we were on vacation this last summer in September, and we were all by our radios waiting for President Obama to talk about the strike on Syria. Right? Usually when a leader lays down a red line, he or she does it, right? Because that's what a red line is. It's called, you go beyond this line, I hit you. Right? Except for President Obama, who decided that, and again in a very personal way and very unpredictable, he decided that he was going to go to Congress for approval of the strike. Now, in our system, that's very strange. I'll tell you why. There are two reasons. One is, constitutionally, he doesn't have to do that. The president can just go and bomb something. I don't know how your constitution works, but maybe it works in a similar way. Or he can take over an area of a country. Who knows? Okay? But here's the most important thing. It wasn't going to cost him anything. President Obama doesn't have to be reelected. Right? So why didn't he just hit Syria? It wouldn't have cost a lot of money in comparative terms. I think it would have cost probably about $300 million, maybe $400 million. But we spend like $500 million a year just on giving out food around Syria every month. Right? No American soldiers would have been killed because they were missile strikes. And it was going to be a small strike. So there really wasn't much of a cost to it. Again, unpredictable. So I think, unfortunately, right now, we are in a contest, right? Since that time, since President Obama made that decision, the opinion on his foreign policy has gone down dramatically. And I think your president has taken advantage of that. And you know what? I don't blame him. I'm not saying that I would do so, but I don't blame him in the sense that I think that there is a sense all over the world that President Obama is not comfortable using military force. And I think elites all over the world are going to test him every day he's in power until the next president. Now, the problem with this is, sorry, this is a longer answer. The problem with this is we have elections coming up. So I would say the opposite of that could be we could have someone much more assertive, and she, in terms of Hillary Clinton, could become much more assertive. And that might involve Russia as well.
Thank you.
Okay, still, no. I am the chairperson. I can't resist temptation to ask a couple of questions myself. I'm fully aware that any attempts to generalize, they quite often would bring us to oversimplification.
That's true.
Nevertheless, we are in Russia, and we are two very typical type of Russian questions. Who is guilty and what to do? In order to avoid the similar type of developments in whatever region, we obviously have to understand, at least in some kind of vague way, what was the main reason? Who was guilty? Was it totally, unavoidable, or in which of its circumstances developments might evolve in a different way? And let's imagine that you are almost almighty. Since we all are in a way unhappy with what is going on in Syria, being almighty, what would you do in order to stop? Not to stop, of course, but to somehow to solve the issue.
Sure. Yeah, those are really good questions. Americans have the same questions too, so don't, okay. I think that Bashar al-Assad's decisions in Syria have been disastrous for his country. When you are the leader of a country, you have to, and you lead a nation, you have to make decisions that are best for the nation. I would not advocate shooting as many people as Bashar al-Assad did, in the sense because it started out as a peaceful protest movement. So I think in that sense, he started the death toll. The problem itself, the political problem itself, has to do with Syria's history. I think the enemy of both the United States, the Western countries, and of Russia, and maybe of all states in the world, the enemy that we have going forward are weak states. Okay? And this is an old story, but there are many states in the world that are strong, and they are able to carry out their treaty obligations and deliver a certain reasonable amount of security for their people. And there are states that are not. So then the question is, what do you do about it? Okay? And I think one of the things I learned when I first went to the region long ago, I'm not going to tell you how long ago exactly, but when I first went to the region, I'm not related to anyone in the region. I didn't speak Arabic, I do now. And what I learned was that most of the time our diplomacy, particularly from the United States, and I think also from the Russian side, and also you're dealing with just the elites inside of the country, and the people don't really matter. But the problem is, now we have many, many, many more people, right? Again, the birth rates go up, and there are just so many more people. Globalization, we call it, or whatever you want to call it, is growing. Everyone has a smartphone. The whole Syrian revolution is on YouTube, right? So these things grow, and with more complexity comes more demands from people. We need more accountable systems. So then the question is, how do you get more accountable systems? I think the way you get more accountable systems is by having more freedom inside of a country, more contestation of politics. But the problem can be, and that's where the almighty part comes in, that you can have chaos in the middle of this, right? Because people don't know how to organize politically. And they don't accept the decision of their organization or their country at the outcome of elections. Instead, they form another faction or they begin fighting. So what do? I think probably the future of the Middle East, and maybe of many developing countries where we have these problems, is what we need are more secure, more accountable systems. Meaning, do I expect them to be like American democracy? I don't. And that's because our system developed over time. I remember my grandfather telling me the first time he voted, it was in the 1930s when Franklin Roosevelt was president. And traditionally, his family was a Republican, came from the Republican Party. And Franklin Roosevelt came from the Democratic Party. And my grandfather didn't have a job, and he was a young man. And so he came into the polling station, and he wanted to vote. And one of the poll workers said to him, "Who are you going to vote for?" He said, "I'm going to vote for Franklin Roosevelt." And the poll worker took him inside of the little room and said, "You don't want to vote for Franklin Roosevelt. I can help you vote." Right? And he tried to vote for Herbert Hoover, who was his challenger. Right? Well, my grandfather kicked him, right? And this is where the future, I think, lies in these countries. The problem is the demands of these people are going up, and they need stability at the same time. We need more accountable systems. I can guarantee you 1,000,000% that Bashar al-Assad is not going to give you stability without a change. Now, what that change is going to be and how it's going to come across, I don't know. But with this system, when it's so inelastic, I can't see going back to the old ways. So we need to find a way in between this, between the chaos of the demonstrations and the brutality of minority-based or just generally military regimes. And it'll be the challenge for all of you to find, okay? Because it's going to happen everywhere. In the United States, we have an extreme version of democracy sometimes that doesn't oftentimes make a lot of sense. But by and large, the good thing is most people listen to when there's a change in election. I didn't vote for George Bush, right? But he was my president for 8 years, unfortunately. And over time, good leaders change. And in the end, President Bush changed over time at the end of his presidency. Now, the interesting part about this is that President Obama's not changing. He's doubling down. And this is where the interesting part comes out. The next 2 years are going to be very interesting. His speech yesterday told us that America's never been stronger, that our economy is growing, that we have health care, and we're about ready to have a deal with the Iranians, okay? And that we should just focus on domestic affairs and let all this other stuff we're just going to be battling against terrorism. This reminds me of a time when I was a very young man in the late 1970s after we lost the Vietnam War, and we had a president named Jimmy Carter. And Jimmy Carter focused on domestic affairs and just diplomacy, the Camp David Accords between the Israelis and the Egyptians. And actually, he did a good job with the Israelis and the Egyptians. But the thing that caused President Carter to lose power and the Democratic Party to lose power had nothing to do with domestic politics. It had to do with Iran. So, as we say in English, watch this space.
Okay. Okay, that means we, unfortunately, time flies and we came to the end of our session today. And I believe we had a very good time indeed. Although probably in some ideas of you challenged what we think, and I believe not everyone would agree, but nevertheless that's what we are here for, in order to stimulate our thinking. And indeed, I would like on behalf of our faculty, on behalf of Innovative University, and on behalf of myself, to thank you very much for your valuable contribution. And let us give a very warm hand to our speaker today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.